This interview is being held February 27, 2018 in Cleburne, Texas. I am Sonia Starnes, and I am a member of Mary Isham Keith Chapter, National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I will be interviewing E.J. Barnes, a veteran of Korea. Also in attendance is Penny Galt, a member of Mary Isham Keith. E.J., let's begin by you telling us when you were born and where.
I was born June 9th, 1933 in Johnson County, Texas, just outside the little town of Grandview, on a farm. My father was a cotton farmer, and we lived on the farm, and I grew up on that farm. I graduated from Grandview High School in 1950, and from there I went to Brantley Drawn Business College for about a year, and then I guess I decided I was too smart for them, and I quit, and I went to work for Sinclair Oil Company. I was an addressograph operator, and I remained there for a couple of years until one day I got a letter from the draft board asking me to become part of the U.S. Army, and said your friends and neighbors have selected you. Well, I've been looking for those friends and neighbors ever since, but that's beyond my control. I went to Dallas for my physical examination, passed it with flying colors, and I came back home, waited about a month, and then on May the 13th, 1953, I got on the bus and headed to San Antonio, Texas to be inducted into the U.S. Army. In San Antonio, I was issued my clothes, and they took my civilian clothes and sent them home, and I then got my military uniforms, and then they put me on a bus and sent me to Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas for my basic training. And I spent the next 4 months in Fort Bliss. The first 2 months was infantry training, marching, shooting a rifle, learning all the commands. And we had some wonderful instructors. We can't say I enjoyed it, but they were good, and they trained us well. Then after 2 months, I moved into anti-aircraft artillery basic training to learn how to fire 50 caliber machine guns. And from that point on, my military career centered around what is known as a quad 50, 450 caliber machine guns mounted on a turret. And we'll get into that a little later on when I get to Korea in my story. But we trained on that for 2 months, and it was quite a powerful weapon, and I was proud that that was a weapon the U.S. Army chose for me to serve on. After 4 months of training, they let me go home for a week. Then I came back to Fort Bliss, got on a train, and sent me to San Francisco, California. And then after about a week in Camp Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, we got on a ship, the USS Man, which is a troop ship, and headed for Korea. After 21 days at sea, we landed in Yokohama, Japan. And after disembarking in Yokohama, then they put us on a train and took us all the way across the islands of Japan to the west coast of Japan, to Nagasaki, Japan. No, it wasn't Nagasaki. My memory's gone bad. Anyway, to the west coast of Japan, and there we prepared to head to Korea. For some unknown reason, out of the 1,500 troops that were on that ship, military people, approximately 30 of us was pulled aside and picked somehow to go to a specialist school before we went to Korea. And for a month we stayed in Japan. We were sent down to a little island called Itajima, Japan. And it had been, before the World War II, it had been the Japanese Naval Academy. Now it was a U.S. base. And we went into training known as CBR school, Chemical, Biological, and Radiological Warfare School. There was some threat, I'm told, in Korea that there would be some use of these weapons by the North Koreans or the Chinese, and they were a little afraid of it, so we were being trained so that when we got to Korea, if need be, we could teach and train others what to do in case of these attacks by chemical, biological, or radiological warfare tactics. After about a month, we were placed on a ship then and went to Korea. We got off at Busan, Korea, on the southern tip of Korea. And there we got on a little narrow gauge train, one like we used to have in the United States, where the little rails were close together and they rocked back and forth they took us for about 100 miles up through the countryside. It took 2 days to go 100 miles, just outside of Seoul, Korea. And then we got off the ship, I got off of the train, and got on a truck, and here we were divided up and sent to our different units throughout Korea. I was assigned to the 40th AAA, Anti-Aircraft Artillery, which was located kind of central Korea. And of course, by this time, the demilitarized zone, the ceasefire had taken place, and the ceasefire took place while we were in basic training. But it was still considered a combat zone. And our gun position was approximately 100 yards from the demilitarized zone, sitting out in the middle of an area called the Chorwan Valley. And we were actually, our position was to guard a radar unit on one side of us, a mortar platoon on the other side, and an infantry unit which was right behind us. And we fired, if necessary, we fired ground and air support in support of those. With the our unit, the company that we were in, the 40th AAA, was back some 10 miles behind the demilitarized zone. This was just a squad, that was placed out here. There was 5 people in the squad. There was a squad leader, 2 machine gunners, two cannoneers who fed the ammunition into the guns, 1 gunner who fired the guns, and then a half-track driver and radio operator combined. So those 5 people, we were, and we lived in a bunker, a dugout underground. The half-track, which this is kind of a model of what the half-track looked like that we were on. As you can see here, this is an armored vehicle with tracks on the back and wheels on the front, and it had the 450 caliber machine gun mounted on a turret here in the back of it, and it was quite a good weapon. It would fire between 2,000 and 2,500 rounds a minute of 50 caliber machine gun bullets, and this is what I was to spend my next few months taking care of and pulling guard duty along the demilitarized zone to make sure that the North Koreans didn't come across the demilitarized zone. And a very interesting thing, as I said, it was a ceasefire, but still a combat zone. The first night I was taken up to my position, and my squad leader, Sergeant Allman, Sergeant said, "E.J., you'll pull get the short straw, so you get 12 midnight to 2 in the morning guard duty." And I said, "Thank you." And I went on guard duty and the others were in the bunkers asleep. And I was out pulling guard duty. We didn't have to walk any particular post. We were just sitting on a little knoll out in the middle of this valley, and our half-track was dug down in it, and where nothing but the guns were sticking out above the hollowed out area, and then behind us was our bunker down underground, and so you really couldn't see much there. And then around us, all the way around the little knoll, was concertina wire, stacked 3 deep, concertina wire being barbed wire in round areas stretched out, and then in that we had tin cans with gravel and rocks and all in them, so if you touched that wire, it made a horrific noise, so as that we could hear anybody trying to get into our position. About 30 minutes to an hour after I went on guard duty that night, the mortar platoon was about 150, 200 yards off to our west side, and all of a sudden I heard all of this shooting around, rat-a-tat-tat-tat, bam, 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 and it scared me to death. I said, the war's over. They have a ceasefire. So I went running in and shook Sergeant Allman, and I said, they're attacking the mortar platoon, they're shooting everything. He said, oh, go on back out. Said, they're just a bunch of North Koreans coming over here trying to steal food from them, and they're running them off. And sure enough, the next morning we found out that's what was taking place. It was, they were slipped into our lines, and this happened practically every night. Somewhere along the lines, there would be firing and shooting and things going on. that we could hear all the time. Shall I continue?
Surely.
All right. Our daily duties was just guard duty. We made sure that the enemy, we could see them up on the mountainsides and everything across from us, but we never had any contact with them or anything, but we were there ready for in case anything happened.
Excuse me, would you like to stop for a minute, pause, and get a drink of water?
No, this is,
Okay.
give me a little bit more and then I will.
All right.
Interesting things like food. We're sitting up here 10 miles from our battery area where the food's served and everything. Where do we get our food? And the infantry unit, which is right behind, about a half a mile right behind us, it was their duty to feed us. And every meal we had to walk back to the infantry unit, and of course we'd go in shifts. We'd never leave our position without being in shifts, and we'd go back and eat. And the infantry unit, we didn't change very often, but the infantry unit changed quite often. They'd move out and a new infantry unit would move in. And this was the United Nations. Korea was not just the United States, it was the United Nations. And there were many different countries involved. So we might be eating today with the United States infantry, and tomorrow, I know the second one that came in was Belgium troops. And I got quite an interesting meal. The first meal, I walked through the line and they placed a couple of rolled up hamburger balls, ground meat, ground up, and laid it on my tray. And I looked at it and it didn't look like it was cooked. It looked like it was raw. And I went over and sat down at the table, and sure enough, it was raw meat. And that's the way they served their ground meat, was raw. And I noticed they were all eating it, but I tried it and I didn't particularly care for it. After that, we learned to take ours and go back up to our gun position, and we had some little Bunsen burner things, and we'd put them in our steel pots and put the Bunsen burner under our helmets and heat it and cook those the meat so that we could eat it there, and instead of and also I noticed that our unit, we got powdered potatoes and dehydrated potatoes. They had fresh potatoes. So every unit that came through had different kinds of food. That it was quite interesting. But to meet and talk to and eat with, Australians, Turkish troops, Greek troops, English troops, French troops, and we had, it was all, of course, the big percentage was Americans, but there were troops from all these other countries there. I didn't see them all, but I saw some of them. And we were on, I think one of the questions said, what did we do for our entertainment or enjoyment and all? Really, there wasn't much to do because we were pulling guard duty 24 hours a day. About once a month, every month or two, we'd have a USO show, in which entertainers would come over and put on shows for us, and we'd get to go see those. One of the highlights was when Marilyn Monroe came over, and she rode into our valley on a tank, and the old boy who was driver of the tank had written on the side of the tank, "Monroe Carriage." And so she was in a USO show. That she was the most well-known person that we ever got to see there in Korea. Actually, I didn't get to see her up close or anything. I was chosen for guard duty during that time. So it wasn't my day to go to a USO show. After about 2 months, one of the questions here is, that was on the sheet you gave me, was getting to know people and camaraderie and still knowing them today. I'm sorry, but I didn't get to know too many people very well. About 2 months was as long as I ever stayed anywhere with any group. For some unknown reason, Uncle Sam chose to move me around all the time. And the first time he moved me around, after I'd been there about 2 months, one night we got a radio message from battery headquarters that told Sergeant Allman to have Private Barnes ready and packed up with his duffel bag and everything for 0600 tomorrow morning. We'll pick him up in a Jeep. Well, next morning I was ready with my duffel bag and all my gear and all, and I threw it in the back of the Jeep and took off. And I got back to the battery headquarters, reported to the battery commander, and I said, Private Barnes reporting, "Sir, what are you calling me for?" He says, "I have no earthly idea. They call for you from battalion headquarters." So he put me back in the Jeep and headed me to the battalion headquarters. Got to battalion headquarters. I went into battalion commander and reported, and he says, "I have no idea. They call for you from division headquarters." Got to division and met a couple of other guys that joined me, and we reported to the division head, and they didn't know. 8th Army had called for us. And when we got back to 8th Army, we finally found out what we were being called for. Out of all of the thousands and thousands of soldiers that were in Korea, about 12 of us were chosen to start a new type of unit. We were connected to all of the radar units in all of Korea by radio, and then in this tent we had this big map of Korea all the way across one end of the tent, and from the radar units would call in to us any aircraft that was in the air north of the demilitarized zone, and we would plot it on that map and gauge their speed and the direction they were going and try to figure out if they were actually going to come into our fly zone or our territory. And if they were, then we'd call out a red alert. And so for 2 months, we had in one area, in a bunker, we were way up on top of a mountain with our radio units and all up there. And then down in the valley, we had this tent with the map and everything, and they'd call in, and then we'd radio it down to the, and plot it and all. And for 24 hours a day, we watched the skies of Korea for aircraft. There, again, our intelligence had picked up that there might be some activities and might see some invasion from air, and we were chosen. Why I was chosen to do such a tour of duty as this, to this day, my wife and I, whom I married after I got out of the Army, we just can't figure out why in the world I was picked to do this kind of duty. But for about 2 months, this is all I did. Then after about 2 months, they decided to dissolve us, and we closed her down, and then we were sent back to, I was sent back to the 40th AAA, and went back to the unit I had been in before, and then stayed there for a couple of months. And the 40th AAA was a National Guard unit from California, and since the ceasefire, they decided to take the 40th Division and send it back home to California. So I was one of the ones. Some of them went back to California with it. Some of them stayed in Korea. I stayed in Korea, and I went to the 3rd Division, 3rd AAA, which moved in somewhat near the same area. I was, and now, probably 20, 25 miles from where I had been located before. And here I was made squad leader over the squad on the half track, and we were guarding a bridge over a river there in Korea, and so as a result, I spent a couple of months there guarding this bridge. And a very interesting thing that happened while we were there, one day we were sitting there in our unit, in our tents, and talking, and we heard all this shooting and explosions and everything going on. So I ran outside, and we were kind of up on the bank above the river, and I crawled through the brush down toward the river so I could see the river where the sound was coming from. And I got down there, and it was a South Korean unit had moved in down by the river, and they were fishing. They were shooting fish with their guns and throwing hand grenades in the water and killing fish and scooping them out with nets and all. And that was getting their fish meal out of the river, which I thought was quite interesting. Question somebody might ask: when we're moving around like this and way out like this, how did you ever bathe? Okay. We didn't very much. But about twice a week, they would come out and pick us up in shifts in a truck and take us to a place we call the shower point. And we'd go into the shower point and pull off our clothes and take a shower and move out the other end. They'd issue us clean clothes, and we'd put them on and go back to our unit. So it was, our needs were taken care of. It was a little primitive, but we were taken care of, and you learn to live with it. The weather over there was not something that we were accustomed to here in Texas. In the summertime, the temperature was up in the 90s, with the humidity was in the 90s also. And it rained practically every day from May until September. And of course, their rice crops, this is ideal for that. And but up where we were, there was no civilians, so the rice growing was non-existent up there. The winter time, it quit raining and started snowing, and it got cold. When I first got to Korea, I got there after they had already issued the winter uniforms. So I had to wait a while to get my winter uniform, and I got a little chilly while I was waiting on it. The temperature, of course right now the Olympics has been going on in South Korea, and the place where the Olympics was held was 40 or 50 miles from where we were stationed. So you can see from the temperature they were having something about the temperature there. One night it got awful cold, and we called by radio to find out what the temperature was, and that night it was 20 below zero. And when it got cold like that, we had to start up our half tracks and run the motors about 10 minutes out of every hour so that it could keep it going. The guns had to be lubricated with dry lubricant instead of oil lubricant, because otherwise they wouldn't fire. It was very cold in the wintertime. After about 2 months here with the 3rd AAA guarding this bridge and area there, the 3rd AAA then was called to be moved out back to Hawaii. And some of the people went back to Hawaii with it. I was chosen to move to another unit. I went to the 26th Division, 26th AAA, and here this unit was located over on the east coast of the Korean Peninsula. And so I moved over there with them, and it was quite interesting there. I was made a squad leader when I moved in again, although I was just a corporal, and I still was made squad leader. And not only, most of my training and everything was on the half track with the quad 50s, and my squad then was 2 vehicles. We had a medium-sized tank with twin 40mm guns on it. So I had 5 more guys that moved into our squad. So we had 5 men on the half track and 5 men on the tank. And we pulled primarily the same kind of duty here over on the East Coast. We were just making sure the enemy didn't come into our area. It was constant guard duty going on. From time to time here, can't remember, backing up a little bit, while I was still in the 40th AAA, they pulled us back to Incheon a couple of times to test our shooting ability. And we had to go back and practice shooting the quad 50s. They had these called RCATs, little airplanes, gas-propelled miniature airplanes, pulling a sleeve across, and we'd shoot at the sleeves and knock them off the airplane and all. And we did fairly well with it. We fired championship shooting, so we did well with that. And of course, so we had to keep up with our abilities on everything. Not only that, but our sidearms, we had to keep trained with those constantly. I say sidearms, we had M1 carbines and M2 carbines, which is a fully automatic carbine. And then we had what was called a grease gun, which is a 45 caliber submachine gun. And I carried those part of the time, and I carried the carbine part of the time. So we became quite well versed in lots of kinds of weapons and everything while we were over there. After a couple of months then, with the 26th AAA, we got orders that the 26th AAA was being moved out back to the United States. And those of us that still had some time left, we were put on a ship and taken back to Japan. And we pulled the rest of our tour of duty in Japan. Quite interesting though, we were on the East Coast with all of this equipment. Now as a squad leader, you were signed out and you were responsible for every bit of this equipment. Any damage to it, loss, anything, unless it was justifiable, it was your responsibility, and you could be made to pay for it. And these were not inexpensive pieces of equipment. So when we got ready to move out, we had to turn in all of our equipment. But we had to turn it in Incheon, which was on the West Coast. So we had to drive over mountain passes and valleys and everything else all the way over to the West Coast and turn it in. And my track driver was not too well experienced, so I pulled rank on him and I drove the track myself. And I drove it all the way across Korea. And by the way, you had to be able to drive a tank or a half-track, you had to have a driver's license. You had to go to a school and you had to learn how to drive it, and then you were issued a driver's license to be able to drive these vehicles. And I had a tank and half-track driver's license. So I was able to, I didn't drive the tank, but I drove the half-track. And then the field artillery people had no way to get their 105 howitzers and things back. So I hooked one of them on behind my half-track, and I not only drove the half-track, but I pulled a 105 howitzer all the way across Korea. We, to say this was quite an experience, that going down these mountain passes and all, and that howitzer hooked on the bumper hitch behind the half-track would get to bouncing back there, and there would be about a 400 to 500 foot drop on one side of the or the other of the road down the mountainside. And it was scary, but I made it fine. And I got all the way down. We turned them in. They picked us up when deuce and a half trucks then, after we got there and turned everything out, took us back across to the other side, and then we helped tear down everything, get everything ready. Then we hauled us all the way back across to Incheon again, and that's where we got on the ships and went to Japan. And then in Japan, I got to Japan then just before Christmas in 1954, and I stayed there, and we stayed in barracks there. We got to live inside, and we just pulled an ordinary soldier type thing, marching, and not much of anything to do. So trying to figure out what. Then about a month later, they decided that there was a little threat back in Korea. So anybody who had several months left to go in the Army, they pulled them out and sent them back to Korea. I happened to be one of the lucky ones that only had a couple of months left to go in my tour of duty. So I stayed in Japan. After we'd been there a couple of weeks, they decided there was nothing for us to do. So one morning they said, "We're sending y'all home." So they began the process of getting us ready to go home, giving us physical examinations. Went to a Japanese dentist, had all my teeth filled that needed to be filled, and quite interesting. Then we got on a ship. Oh, by the way, I was going to show you this. This is a picture of me on a half track in Korea. That was a warm hat. The ear flaps would come down over your ears, so you wouldn't be. Of course, if any firing, we had steel helmets that we wore if anything happened. But otherwise, we'd wear these caps that had fur-lined ear flaps to keep our ears warm and everything. And of course, here's the barrels of the guns. This right here is flak vest hanging there on that. They were made out of lead, weighed about 50 pounds, and you'd put those on whenever you were in actual combat to make sure that exploding bombs, that would stop the flak from those exploding bombs and might save your life.
Is that your dog tag at the bottom?
Huh?
Is that your dog tag at the bottom of the picture?
Well, this is a canister where all the machine gun bullets and everything.
But on the
Oh, the
frame.
dog tag, yeah. Yeah, this is my dog tag here that everybody wore dog tags around their necks in case you got killed.
Injured.
Then they'd know who you were and who to notify and this type of thing from the dog tag.
You have another photograph. You want to show that? Can you pick it
This
up?
is the ship we came home on. Yes, and this is a group of the soldiers here. There was about 1,432
32.
soldiers, veterans, Korean veterans, that came home on this ship. When we got to San Francisco, I found out why this was called the Forgotten War. There was one man on the docks, and that was a photographer from the San Francisco paper that took this picture. And that was the only person there that welcomed 1,400 soldiers that had spent 12 to 16 months in Korea. I spent right at 16 months over there. From there, they put us on a train, took us back to El Paso. We got in there late one afternoon. The next morning they processed us, handed me my discharge papers, handed us the money, went down, bought a ticket on the bus, and took off for Grandview, Texas.
Well, that brings us back to where your family can be.
And got back to Grandview. Of course, the bus station in Grandview is a little hamburger joint. And I got off the bus and went in thinking they would all welcome me. And it was like, who's this guy? Where's he from? I asked to use their telephone so I could call my parents. I had not written them and told them that I was coming home because the mail, if I'd mailed it in Japan, by the time I got home, they'd have gotten a letter about a week later. So even though it took 18 days to go from Japan, coming back, it took us 18 days on the ship. And I called home, and my brother answered the phone. I don't think I told about my brothers and sisters and everything earlier.
No.
My mother and dad were Lewis and Mina Barnes. He was a cotton farmer, and he was out in the field plowing that day. My brother answered the phone, and his name is Jimmy Barnes, and he got in the car, and my two sisters, Elizabeth and Woody Mae, jumped in the car with him and headed to town to pick me up. And my youngest sister was only 3 years old when I left home. So when I got in the car, I was a stranger to her. She had no idea who I was. And it was, here she was grown up to be a much bigger girl. And then I wondered, where's my mother? Why didn't she come? Where's Daddy? Nobody said anything, but I was just so happy to be home. We went home. I found out years later that they didn't even tell my mother that they were coming to get me. That she was off in the kitchen cooking or somewhere, and they didn't even tell her. And she was mad at them because but they came and got me. My adjustment to civilian life, I had no problems. The one problem I had was food. I had been so accustomed to the bland U.S. Army food that the rich civilian food gave me stomach ulcers. And it took me a while to get accustomed to the food, but that was the only problem I had, and was in adjusting back to civilian life. And shortly after I got home, one day my mother was a housewife. She was a farm wife and worked on the farm with my dad. But she also substituted at the school where I graduated from in the cafeteria when they needed a substitute cook. So one morning she said, "I've got to go to school today and cook. Miss So-and-so's sick today." So she said, "EJ, come up to school and eat lunch with me, and maybe you can see some of your old teachers and all." And I said, "Fine." I got up there and was sitting behind the serving lines with her, and this pretty little girl came walking through the line. I said, "Mama, who is that girl there?" She said, "That's Ms. Harper's daughter." Ms. Harper was a new teacher there at Grandview that wasn't a teacher there when I was there. And I said, "Oh, okay." And my mother claims she introduced us, but I don't. That's all I remember is her telling me that that was Ms. Harper's daughter. And then after I ate lunch, I went up to the office to see the superintendent who had been my coach when I was in school. And when I got up to his office, he was busy and I couldn't see him. But the young lady who I asked who was in the line happened to be working in the office that period. So she and I engaged in conversation. That was on a Tuesday, I think it was. We had a date on Friday night. We've been married 60 years.
Congratulations.
We went to college after she graduated from high school. This was in March of 1955. She graduated from high school in May. I went back to work for Sinclair Oil Company, but then I decided I need some more education. So the U.S. Army experience provided me with an education through the GI Bill. I got my bachelor's degree. I went 2 years to Arlington State College, which was a junior college at the time. And then I went over to Texas Wesleyan College, where LaRue was my to-be wife, was going to college. And we got married between our junior and senior year in college. And we graduated in 1950, in May of 1958. And then I also, I got my first degree in sales and marketing, and that was not my way of life. I tried it, I tried salesmanship, and that wasn't mine. While I was in college, I worked in the credit department of Leonard's department store for 3 years, so I knew the credit business. So I became a credit manager of a department store in Cleburne, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do. One night, my dad, who was very disappointed that I didn't want to be a farmer like he was, told me, he said, he was on the school board at Grandview. He said, the Gilmer-Akins bill was passed and they're paying teachers better. Have you ever thought about teaching? And I said, no, I hadn't. So I went the next day and applied to teach. A couple of months later, the school called me, and I went to teaching school at Cleburne High School, and I taught school drove a school bus, was housemaster, and was vice principal and principal of Cleburne High School for 31 years before I retired. And now I've enjoyed retirement for 25 years. Is there anything that y'all would like to ask me that I've left out?
I think that's a wonderful interview. Is there anything else you want to put on this tape?
Well, I would just say that my experience in the Army was, there was no fighting or anything. I did see death. In fact, my first death I saw was on board ship going over. Two soldiers got mad and were arguing with one another. In a troop ship, you're on bunks stacked up about 7 deep, and they got to arguing over whether to turn the light off or on above them. And one of them fell out of his bunk with a knife in his hand. And there I was, sitting down below him. I was in the bunk down below him. And he stabbed and killed the other soldier right there. And of course, he spent the rest of his trip in the brig on the ship, and then came back to the United States, I'm told, and I don't know what his sentence was or anything, but I'm sure he was punished severely. So things happen, and you get to meet lots of kind of people, just like the first squad I was in. My squad leader was an African American. He was sergeant. The track driver was Spanish. And we had another gunner, cannoneer, that was Puerto Rican. One of them was, I guess I can say, a Yankee. He was from Rhode Island. So I got to meet and get to somewhat know, in the short period of time that I was with them, people from all over the United States and the world. And I'm grateful for that. I got experiences that I would have never had I not gone to the Army, and my love for the United States of America and that Stars and Stripes is deep. It tears me up to see people that don't salute the flag and this type of thing. We have a wonderful country. We've got the greatest country in the world, and my love for it really got deep while I was in the U.S. Army.
Thank you. We did want to, since you said it's for genealogical purposes, let's mention your family again. You had your father and your mother. You mentioned those. How many siblings did you have?
I had 3. I had 2 sisters and a brother. My brother was Jimmy Lewis Barnes. My next sister was Elizabeth Kathleen, now Hewlett, Barnes Hewlett. And my younger sister, who is deceased, was Willie Mae Barnes Elam. And her husband was in the Navy during the Vietnam conflict, which is the only one other besides myself. That was my older sister, Elizabeth, has a son who just retired from the Navy as a captain, flew aircraft off of an aircraft carrier, some 700 landings on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. So our family, and then she has some grandsons that are in the military now.
Okay, you and LaRue had children.
We've got 2 children. My daughter, Joni, is married, Joni Barnes Melson. She is a school teacher here in Cleburne, followed in footsteps of her mama and me.
And she has 2 children.
And then my son, Robert Edward Barnes, Bob as we call him, he's in law enforcement. He's the head of the probation department for Johnson and Somerville counties here, and has been for several years.
And you have grandchildren.
Oh yes, grandchildren. My daughter has 2 daughters, Lauren Hundley, Callahan. Yeah, excuse me. Lauren Hundley Callahan and her husband Taylor live in Fort Worth. And Lauren is a teacher in the Burleson School District. Then her younger sister, Elise Hundley, is at present time training to be an airline stewardess in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And my son has 2 children. He has a son, Nathan, who is a sophomore in Cleburne High School, and his wife, Tina, is a counselor at Cleburne High School. And then their daughter, Katie, is in the 7th grade at Wheat Middle School here in Cleburne. So I have a wonderful family. God has blessed me beyond what it should have been.
We thank you very much.
I thank you for allowing me to do this.
We have a certificate that we want to present to you. This is from our DAR chapter. And it says, in appreciation to Edward Joe E.J. Barnes for participating in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project.
Thank you very, very much.
And we have a Veteran History Project pin that we would like to have. And only the people that have participated get that.
Oh, great.
Thank you again.
Thank you all.